Wanted to just welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. How many of you have been out to our museum campus before? Would you raise your hand? Oh, great. Well, for those of you that haven't been here before, I would just like to let you know that we are a nonprofit organization that is raising money to build a world-class museum here in the Missoula area to showcase the history of the U.S. Forest Service and America's conservation legacy. So this museum campus is a work in progress. We were able to open it last fall, and we have our visitor center in this historic ranger's cabin, which came from the Bungalow Ranger District in the Clearwater National Forest. In the future, the cabin will serve as an exhibit of what it was like to live as a ranger back in the day and the ranger's family. But for now, we're using it as a visitor center. We have an interpretive trail, as you can see, and we're adding to this all the time. And our next big construction project is actually going to start here in the next couple of weeks. We are building a stage, an amphitheater, that will feature historic timber framing techniques, and so the stage itself will be an exhibit in that wonderful historic art form. And I would like to introduce a couple of people today. We have some staff members here. I'd like to introduce Tom Peterson. He's in the back. Tom is our development director for the museum. I'd like to introduce Cheryl Hughes. Cheryl is our education director. And my name is Lisa Tate, and I'm the executive director for the museum. And I'm going to let Cheryl introduce our featured guest today. So Cheryl, here you go.
Yeah, thanks. I'm gonna use this because I'm gonna cheat a little bit and read some of this to you. John posted on Facebook early in the spring that he had finally finished his book, and I wrote him immediately and said, "Can we do a launch for you in Missoula?" And he said, "Absolutely." So he's here today as a result of that. You know that John is an award-winning author and journalist who's written about wildland fire for more than 2 decades. His fifth and latest book, River of Fire, The Rattlesnake Fire and the Mission Boys, and then as well, others include Fire on the Mountain, The True Story of the South Canyon Fire, and the Esperanza Fire. Before writing about fire, John was for 30 years a reporter with the Chicago Tribune, of course, and he was stationed in Washington as a correspondent. He was one of the Kissinger 14, and if you get a chance, ask him about that experience. It's an amazing tour that he had in the 70s with Kissinger and those folks. He was in Washington, and then he and his family now, after his retirement, divide their time between Washington, D.C., where he lives very close, he tells me, to the Washington Cathedral, and Seeley Lake, where his family cabin is and has been for, nearly 100 years, John? 1921, almost 100 years. Maybe we'll have to have a birthday party. At any rate, I'd like to welcome John, and I know that you're as anxious as I am to hear about his new book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cheryl, for that very nice introduction. Do you have any idea how daunting it is to get up in front of an audience such as this, which represents I don't know how many centuries of fire and forest experience, and try to tell them about a fire that you never fought? I was here about a year ago and talked about the legacy of my family and its connections with the Forest Service. And in the ensuing year, as a consequence of finishing River of Fire, I've learned a good deal. And I find that that's mostly what I do, is try to catch up and to learn things. And I learned a very important thing from one of the people in California who has been one of the keepers of the Rattlesnake Fire, a former Mendocino hotshot named Don Will. I've been doing this for 25 years, and when I first published a book or two, people would ask me at events like this, "What do you think you've done?" And I would say something like, "Well, I wrote a book or two." And I knew I'd done something that was bigger than me. And I knew that I hadn't finished it, that I'd started something bigger than me. So we get to the Rattlesnake Fire, and I wrote about it in a book called Fire and Ashes that was published in 2003. It was in my second book, and it was a book of stories. The story of the Rattlesnake Fire was a little over 100 pages, and it was one of these things that grew. I called up a friend of mine, Dick Mangan, who used to be here at MTDC, and I think he still lives right on the Clark Fork. And I said, Dick, I'm looking for a second story. And he said, well, why don't you do the Rattlesnake Fire? And I said, well, what's it all about? He said, well, you got it in your book, John, in Fire on the Mountain. And so I went back and looked it up, and sure enough, I had a little thing about it because it was a landmark. 15 guys got killed, firefighters. So I started working on it. And it was originally a secondary story in that book. And as I continued my inquiry, it got to be better and better. I found the guy who started it, a fellow named Stan Patton, who had never really explained himself. He had confessed. I had his written confession, a transcript of it. But in court, he was a yes sir, no sir kind of guy. And he never talked to the media, and he never explained really himself. And I was sitting in Willows, California one night in a motel, and I hadn't been able to find Stan. I'm a fan of World War II and of General Patton, and boy, you couldn't find him on the internet, couldn't find him anywhere in telephone directories. And finally I said, well, there's a local telephone directory here, I'll look there. And sure enough, there's Stan, P-A-T-T-A-N. All the early news reports had him O-N. And there's a telephone number. So I called him. The guy answers, and he said, I didn't know what I was going to say. One thing you learn about Stan Patton very quickly is that he lived in his father's shadow. His father had been a very well-regarded Forest Service engineer. Everybody knew Phil Patton. And that's a theme in the book. Stan Patton walks into a bar, and the bartender looks up and says, here's Phil Patton's kid, have a drink on me. And it worked on him. So when he answered the phone, I said, I'm looking for Phil Patton's son. There's a long pause. He said, that's me. And he was proud of it. I said, well, I'd like to talk to you about the Rattlesnake Fire. I'm writing a book about it. And there was an even longer pause. And then he said, all right, I'll talk to you. I said, thank you, I'll be there in 15 minutes. And I was. I knew where he lived, just down the road. And that started a relationship that lasted until his death after the book came out, of old age. He died at the age of 82. So that wasn't a bad thing to have in there. And then a friend of mine, who was a chief in Chico for what was then CAL FIRE, the old CDF, now what is now CAL FIRE, it was then the old CDF, John Hawkins, and I were talking about this, and he said, well, would you like to recreate the fire? I said, darn right I would. Let's see if we can't do that. So he got over 30 people. We went to the scene of the Rattlesnake Fire. And it was a mess. It was on a road that had been turned into a very secondary road because they'd put in a new paved highway, one ridge over to the south. And the only people who went in there to shoot guns, drink beer, and be with their girlfriends. And it was all rutted and nasty, which was about the way it would have been in 1953. So we did that. We recreated the fire. We got over 30 guys, came in there, tried to recreate where the fire lines were. There was no identification. The only identification in that canyon was a huge white cross with no markers on it. I finally got that story. The Mendocino hotshots, in a kind of a midnight operation, had built this thing, got tanked up on beer, went in, dug a hole, said the kind of words you say when you do that, dropped in the little kind of things that you see from the Vietnam Memorial, homely stuff. You see it from South Canyon. Small, seemingly inconsequential, and means everything. Then they all took a hand and drove that cross into the ground, and there it stood, unmarked. So I published the story, 2003. On account of the story and many, many other things. That whole site has been recovered. And is now a formal staff ride that's used by 300 to 400 young firefighters every year. They go through it to the posts where things happen, and they assume the characters of that day and learn lessons from this. Little things would happen after 2003. Stan died. Survivors showed up. There was a memorial in 2005 when they opened the whole thing up. They recovered all the lines. They put in crosses where the bodies fell, and I gave a talk at that. And as these things would happen, I would add to the story. Well, that went on for 15 years, and the story grew from about 100 pages to about 200 pages. And when do you do this? When do you bring it out again? This February, my longtime editor, Kelly Anderson, called me up and said, John, if you're ever going to do this, you better do it now, because I'm getting older. And the subtext there is, and so are you. Get to it. So we started working on it, and it took me a couple of weeks then to go through and smooth it all out and add all the things that need to be added. And we had at that point a redo of the old story. And then things started to happen that turned it from a redo of an old story into what it is, which is something that is very forward-looking. Kelly got a hold of a photographer named Kari Greer, who had an exhibition here in Missoula earlier this year. She's a noted wildland fire photographer and is both artistic and hard-nosed realistic. She works for NIFC all the time. She's done this professionally. Her photos are absolutely great. She went to the scene twice for us. And she hooked up with 3 former Mendocino hotshot superintendents who were the keepers of the Rattlesnake Fire site. And they got her into the lore of the fire and the meaning of it and got her interested. And she took wonderful photographs in color. And of course, we're bringing out a book in black and white. So Kelly and I looked at this stuff and said, we can't stop here. It's too good. First of all, let's put a photo gallery in the book. It's independently published. We can do whatever the hell we want. Let's put a photo gallery. The reason we didn't do it in color, I will tell you, is a very practical reason. It costs 8 times or 6 times or 7 times as much to bring out a hardcover book with color photography as it does to bring out what we brought out. It's just, you don't make any money, and it costs you an awful lot. So we didn't do that. But then we said we'll do a Kindle, and we'll take the pictures in color and we'll put in a lot more on the Kindle edition, which is now out. I haven't seen it because I'm a technological Luddite, and I don't have anything that will bring down the Kindle down, but I will get some adept modern friend who will help me with that. So we're starting to cook here. We got a book that really looks different because it's got all the modern stuff. It's got the fire lines and the guys at the White Cross, and they run into a couple of hotshot kids the last day of the shoot. One of them is a real hotshot, the other one wants to become a hotshot, and they're doing the staff ride on their own. And they talk to them, and it's worth a little sidebar story. So then Kelly and I are talking, we said, well, we got to have a forward for this. We got to explain what happened. I said, yeah, and we'd actually looked for somebody to do it for 2 or 3 years. I said, I do not want anybody who's academic, and I do not want anybody who's literary. I want somebody from the fire world. She said, well, there's always a problem, that they always claim they can't write. I said, we're going to find somebody. And Kelly went to Don Will, the former superintendent, and said, Don, how'd you like to write a forward? Oh, no, I can't write. I can't do nothing of that kind. Big, tough guy. And she said, look, Don, think of it like this. You got a young firefighter. It's his first year in fire, and you take him to the Rattlesnake Fire, and you sit him down. What do you tell him to last for the rest of his career to help him out? And he said, well, I just did that with my son. This is his first year as a hotshot on my old hotshot crew. And I took him to the Rattlesnake Fire. She said, you write that. It's a 10-page forward, and I swear to you, if you read it with a dry eye, you're a cold fish. We all get real wet reading that one. And it's beautifully written. I just exchanged a couple of notes with him. I sent him that Missoulian story from yesterday, and he wrote back thanking me for doing that. And, it means everything to these guys. I mean, they brought this site back to life, and it's life. It isn't a 1953 fire. It's what's happening today that saves lives tomorrow. That's what this fire is. And Don talks about that, about it being a renaissance. And the title we put on the foreword was Passing It On. And as I've thought about that, that explains to me what I've been doing for 25 years. My dad wrote Young Men on Fire, about the Man Gulch Fire of 1949. I'm working on a book about the Yarnell Hill Fire of 2013. I've written about the 1910 fire, so we've all mentioned it. A lot of fires mentioned in between. Between the two of us, 6 books, and I'm working on a 7th, count Young Men on Fire in there. We have created a narrative history of wild on fire disasters that is without parallel in the literature of nonfiction natural disasters, period. Nobody's done this before. Nobody's done the hurricanes of the 20th century, father, son. The closest I've been able to get to it is Mike and Jeff Shahara. Mike Shahara wrote that magnificent novel, Killer Angels, about the Gettysburg Battle. His son Jeff has picked up and written a number of books, fictional books, novelistic books, about the Civil War. You know how many books I've read called Gettysburg? 4, 5. Wonderful books. Everybody writes about that. Nobody else has done what we've done. So that kind of explained to me my work ethic and why I have to keep going with this. Which brings us to the Yarnell Hill Fire. I've never done a book before where the ground has been so broken up ahead of time by other books. I like to hunt alone. I left the Chicago Tribune after 30 years, partly because I wanted to get onto stories where I was the only one really doing it. I've done a lot of pack journalism. I've done a lot on my own during my newspaper career. But I didn't really have the feeling that, I owned a story and I was the only one who owned it, that I'd either driven other people out or other people hadn't been able to pick up on it. Yarnell Hill isn't like that. There have been, depending on how you count it, 5 books already and 1 movie. The general consensus with which I agree is that the books have not dealt adequately with the fire itself. They have dealt adequately with some other aspects of it. There's a very good story by D.J. Helm, a book about her experience at the what is called the Boulder Springs Ranch, misnamed in the investigation report. The real name of it is not much of a ranch. All hyphenated. And it's M-U-C-H-V-A. And she talks about nearly being killed by the fire, which is what happened. Fire blew over their ranch. That was the safety zone that the Granite Mountain Hotshots were aiming for and were 6 to 10 minutes away from when they were killed. And it was a harrowing experience, and she writes very well. I helped her with that. But there are other books, and they deal with the people. And there was a fast book that came out quickly afterward that is just, it's not accurate about the fire. The tree, 12-inch, this is a 12-inch lodgepole or 16-inch lodgepole, thudded to the ground, and the men felt their boots shake. If you feel the ground shake under your feet, it is an earthquake. It is not a 16-inch lodgepole. And I'd actually confronted that question on my first book on the South Canyon Fire, where all hell was breaking loose and big trees were coming down. And I talked to one guy, Kevin Erickson, down here, lives in the Bitterroot near Hamilton, brother-in-law of Don Mackey. And I said, when that happens, when there's this great thudding by the fire, the pulses you can feel. And I said, it did shake the ground. He just laughed and came up with the same answer. When the ground shakes, it's an earthquake. So that book was not well done. So why would I do Well, what's happened to me is I no longer hunt alone. I didn't on River of Fire, and it really helped me to have Kari Greer and Don Will, Darren Dalrymple, John Tishner, Chris Cuoco, the weatherman from the South Canyon fire, recreates the fire the day of the Rattlesnake Fire in 1953. Jim Barry talks about going to the South Canyon fire site, realizing what a wonderful memorial it was, and bringing the idea back to the Rattlesnake Fire under bylines. And I've got a partner on the Yarnell Hill Fire. Her name is Holly Neal. She's a former firefighter, and she is deadly. She's really good. We form a good partnership. We're both strong personalities, and we clash from time to time, and we disagree about a fundamental issue, but not so we're within too great a distance apart that we can't function. Holly has been on the Yarnell Hill Fire from the day it happened. So have I. The day it happened, I was at my cabin at Seeley Lake, and I started getting calls. One of the calls was from a friend of mine who ranches at Seeley Lake, and said, my wife is down in Yarnell right now, trying to get her grandmother out of a house that is threatened by the fire, and Granny won't go. How often have you heard that one? You know? Esperanza Fire, there was a woman in a mobile home, and they tried to get her out. The firefighters, they can't force her out. By law, you can't force her. And she said, no, I'm eating my sandwich and my parrot is here. And finally, they got a local person who knew her and got her out of there. And her home burned to the ground. And they saved the parrot. Firefighters saved the parrot, too. So Holly and I have been working together on this, and she, frankly, more than I, because I've been doing other things like River of Fire. And we've got a couple more years to go. The central question of the Yarnell Hill Fire is, why did 19 men leave a relatively safe spot that was pretty good black on a ridgetop, walk 12 to 14 to 15 minutes along a ridge when they could see a fire advancing toward them in the valley below and knew a wind event was coming behind it that would accelerate it and turn it into a torrent, descend into a box canyon where at best they would have had one person, the superintendent, Eric Marsh, acting as lookout, and get themselves killed. The simple answer to this is they blew it. Eric Marsh made a terrible decision. He was totally negligent, irresponsible, impetuous. All you have to do is not be Eric Marsh, and you have learned all the lessons of the Yarnell Hill Fire, and that's not true. It was a terrible decision. That's my side of it. My side of it is if they'd made it, there should have been severe disciplinary action against Eric Marsh for even trying it. After 4 o'clock in the afternoon in the Southwest, monsoon season, warnings of a storm coming in with winds, you can see the fire. There's video of it. These guys took video of the fire. Big line of fire running their way, billowing. In a drought, extreme heat, and you leave a relatively safe spot? Okay. At this point, let me go back to Henry Kissinger. I didn't much like him. I thought he was a devious person and had some black, dark thoughts zinging back and forth in his head. In retrospect, I have enormous respect for him. One of the things that Henry Kissinger did was hold the United States government, not just the foreign policy side, but a little beyond that too, together during the decline and fall of Richard Nixon. Nixon was drinking heavily. He was falling apart. He was crumbling. And one of the things that everybody worries about when a president starts to fall apart in the modern age is that he's going to push the button to take everybody's mind off his personal problem. And Henry Kissinger held up Richard Nixon. He stayed with him. He didn't run away from him. He supported him. He treated him with respect. And at one point, he fell on his knees and prayed with him. And I didn't believe it. And the next time I was in the plane with Henry, going somewhere, I asked him, I said, you know, there are all these reports that you prayed with Richard Nixon. I said, did that really happen? And he looked at me with his cold, hard eye. And he said, I'm not, Javel, I'm not exactly the praying type. Which meant he did. And I wasn't smart enough or tough enough to do the follow-up question and say, does that mean you did? Because everybody, the whole press corps burst into laughter. They thought this was great. We all loved Henry, yada, 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 and we moved on. There's a new foreign policy columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and in one of his early columns, he wrote about what it's like to write foreign policy once a week, where you've really got to say something. You're not just following the news. And he had talked to Henry Kissinger, now in his 90s, the senior statesman, and said, how do I do this? How do I write foreign policy? And Kissinger said, you've got to give context. You've got to put these events in context. You can't just rehearse them and say, here's what happened this week. You've got to go way back and find out what really happened that is affecting today. And that's what you have to do with the Yarnell Hill fire. And that's what we're doing that takes so bloody long. 5 years already. We went back to the day before the fatalities that nobody had paid any attention to. And we've finished with that now, and we showed it to a senior forest official in Prescott who knew the Granite Mountain guys intimately. And he read it and he said, you've got to get this out. We have to know this. We have to get this out in public. And that's big. And then there are other things. My research partner, Holly Neal, read the investigation report, which said there was a 33-minute communications gap before the guys got killed. At the end, as many of you I think know and have seen, there is a 7-minute plus video that has the audio of the Granite Mountain hotshots in the last minutes of their lives. It's on YouTube, and it's chilling. But prior to that, there is a supposed 33-minute communications gap. And Holly said, they had an aerial fire survey going on at the same time. But they'd set a camera on the road, and they were filming the planes. It was just a generalized survey. They had 2 DC-10 jumbo jets dropping on that fire. So a lot going on. And she said, I'll bet you, in that air, with the audio, with the air-to-air, that there's background stuff that's ground-to-ground or ground-to-air or air-to-ground, as well as the stuff in the air. And she put in a Freedom of Information Act request and got the audio tapes. And sure enough, the Granite Mountain guys are talking. They're reporting. It isn't entirely clear, but it's very suggestive in a lot of ways, and some of it is clear. It frankly adds to the difficulties. Who's talking to them? Who says, yeah, I understand what you're doing? Who said that? There are about 3 candidates, and they all deny it. It's real. This is a real touchy fire. 19 people die, and woo. It's been very hard because the agencies have shut people off. Blue Ridge Hotshots were there. It's a Forest Service it's a Forest Service crew, and they gave a group interview. I talked to the guy who ran the first investigation, Jim Carrolls, who's the Florida State Forester. He said, you know what I did, John, just deliberately? He said, I made sure that we didn't have any names in there. We mixed it all together in the transcript so you guys wouldn't know who was who. Well, we figured it out. It's a puzzle, but we figured it out. And then we went to some of the Blue Ridge hotshots, and they wouldn't talk on the record. So that's the kind of thing we've had to try to pry out. And it takes a long time. And I hope and pray that I am given the time to finish this, and I need at least 2 years. Okay. So that's what's been happening. And I'm learning from other people these days, more than I'm learning from myself. I'm learning from Holly, from Kari. One of the things I liked about Kari was that she was kind of modest, and it's hard for her to talk. And so I said, what we're going to do? We're going to always have about the author in the book, this stuff. So we're going to put in about the photographer, independently published. So we have a page in there with her picture about Kari Greer. And we don't have one about me. So I'm having fun. But I'm going to turn this over to you for questions and see what you have to say. I imagine some of you have questions, and I imagine some of you have things to say. And I'm going to give you the microphone because I have to be able to hear what you say.
I saw you in Hamilton when you gave a talk in 08 or 9, I think. And at that time, I asked you about a fire, and you said something to the effect that lawsuits were pending and you couldn't get involved with that. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that was a 30-mile fire. I believe you're talking about the 30-mile fire, which, is that right? Yeah, well, let me just deal with the legal situation, because that's one of the things that has made my life much more difficult, which isn't the biggest thing in the world. At the time of the South Canyon fire, there were, people would take legal steps, but it wasn't everybody taking this step at the same time. On the Man Gulch fire, there was a legal challenge by the father of one of the men who was killed. The guy was a forest ranger, and he said, you did it all wrong. You went down when you should have gone up and gotten out of the gulch. And as a consequence of that, the Forest Service went back and did a second investigation, sat Bob Sally down. I know this because he told me about it. And said, here's what happened, Bob. Sign it. And he said, well, it's close enough to what happened, so he signed it. So it isn't as though there were never a lawsuit or legal trouble. The 30-mile fire is kind of a break point. And the reason is that the first report that came out said if the people who died had listened to the order that they were given, or whatever you want to call it, direction that they were given, by the person who was acting as IC, Ulrich Daniels, they would have saved their lives. They would have come down onto the road where people survived. They didn't do that. And the parents just went absolutely ballistic and said, you're accusing our children of causing their own deaths. And the outcry was so immediate by survivors who had been there, said it wasn't like that, that they redid the investigation and came out with options. This might have happened, this might have happened, that might have happened. But there was a lot of pressure, and the IC Ulrich Daniels wound up being charged. I spent a long time with his defense lawyer. Charges got watered down. People were just looking for trouble with lawsuits. On Yarnell, it was enormous. The number of lawsuits that were filed by families afterward would have sunk and bankrupted the city of Prescott. And as a consequence, those were finally watered down. The state of Arizona wound up imposing a huge financial penalty on itself. The Occupational Safety and Health Division imposed a big financial penalty on the Arizona Forestry Division, which had run the fire, for negligence, this, that, and the other thing. I mean, everybody's throwing rocks at everybody else in court on this. And that was eventually toned down, but not out. So that legal situation has become extreme, and people who are in fire management are keenly aware of it, which is one reason people don't talk as much as they used to, because they can get sued. They can go to jail. The closest anybody going to jail is an arson case involving an Arizona fire management officer who wound up going to jail for arson. that doesn't have anything to do with this kind of event. I mean, that's just a plain, straightforward criminal case. So it has created a lot of tension, and I don't know how much good it's done. There were final settlements in Prescott with the families. They were not what they went after, but it's settled. And as a consequence, the city of Prescott, which had been the only municipality in the nation to sponsor a hotshot crew, ended its participation in that program. They now have a brush crew that deals with interface issues, but they don't have a hotshot crew anymore. There's one other semi-municipal one that had, oh God, I'm gonna mess this up. I think it was Tucson, and they had part of their area was in northwest Tucson, and part of it was in a rural fire district. And they looked at the liability issue. They had a hotshot crew, and they ended it. Said, let's get out of this. The only people who should have hotshot crews are federal and state agencies because they've got the money in case something like this happens. So that whole legal field has become very cluttered. And I ask myself sometimes, how much good has this done? I guess the families feel it's done some good for them because they got more than the death settlement out of it, and it's an avenue for them to express themselves. But maybe somebody has a better idea than I do about that, about how great this has been for firefighting.
Have you ever been sued?
I have never been sued. 1964 to this day, and I've covered a lot of court stuff. And that's where you get it. When I was 23 years old, I was covering criminal courts for the Chicago Tribune. It was Vietnam War era. They needed warm bodies, and I was a warm body. And they told me, said, all right, get over there and do your best job, but just remember, you're not a real reporter at the criminal courts until you've cost the company $50,000 in a lawsuit. Well, come on, you're moving fast, things are going. All you have to do is say black is white, and you're dead. It's full of lawyers. But I have never been sued. Have I stunned you all into silence? That happens. Jim Haybeck, who is a chronicler of things Maclean.
In 1952, the summer of 1952, when I was 21 years old, I was in charge of a 50-man fire crew in the Bob Marshall. And they handed me, at the base camp, a radio from World War II surplus. And they said, if the fire attempts to escape, you have to climb up to this ridge top to get back to the camp. Holy crap. But I would ask John here about the historical research. My son, who is on incident command team, he says every time he goes on a fire, you can see different kinds of survey ribbons tied to trees, the same tree. Why? Why do they do that? Because that's the only damn place that people can make a call out. And this is 2017 or so, not 15 too. So I'm just saying that the science of communication deserves John's book writing, I guess. The radio, this communication, not fire. You could have all sorts of flooding or earthquakes or all sorts of things that could be an emergency. Even if you have this thing on your hand, how the hell are you going to get calling out if you can't climb to the top of the tree or top of a ridgetop? So John's going to tell us exactly how that's worked out.
Yes, and different colors for different Verizon and AT&T and so on. No, they don't. Yeah, communication's a big deal, and it varies from place to place. And I can't hear unless you get on the mic. Somebody's got.
It's okay. Yeah.
Go. I was asked at a previous talk, are you going to write about the big issues of the day? Megafire, climate change, hotter, faster fires. Write a book about that. Or are you going to continue with pause? The classic approach. And it was said in such a way that I could have interpreted it kind of, are you going to continue being stubbornly conventional? And what I told the guy was, I don't write about those big issues except inferentially in the books. I write reconstructions of fires, and I want those books to last 25 years or more. If I wrote a big book about the current interface and climate change issues, it would be used for kindling in 3 years. And I'm not going to do that. There are people who do this. The bookshelves for fire books right now are sagging with accounts. When I started this 25 years ago, I thought, it's great. I live in Washington, D.C. I've got the Library of Congress. Got my research card, went into the files, and there was my dad's book, Young Men and Fire, and Steve Pine, and his 325 books, and nothing else. And then I started looking for it, and I'd find occasional books, personal accounts, such as, I will never fight fire with my bare hands again. But they weren't really what I was looking for. And the model I found was one that I'd found when I was a kid. I was born during World War II, and I grew up reading combat literature. And if you read the literature of patrols by people who were there, it's very much like what I do. You send out a patrol, it has a lieutenant, and maybe a sergeant, very structured. That's how decisions are made. You're marching into a wild area against an enemy, and you do it step by step by step by step. That's what I do. That was my model. So I'm not going to write that big book about communications, but I will guarantee you this, that what you see today in firefighting is going to look fundamentally different in 15 years because of technological change, and because of skittishness about fire safety, and extreme skittishness about burning out 1,500 houses. I mean, there's a lot of pressure that there didn't used to be. Once they get drones more advanced than they are now, you can get communication drones. So you don't have to tie pink ribbons to fir trees on a ridgeline. You just put a drone over a fire. The problem now is to get drones the hell away from fires. Because as soon as somebody puts up a drone, you have to stop the whole air show. And air show is the modern wave of how you're going to solve the fire problem. There is a reason they call it wildfire. You're not going to solve the fire problem. You're going to deal with it. Not going away. It shouldn't go away. Did we learn that in 1988 in the Yellowstone fires? The jewel in the crown of the National Park Service is being destroyed by fire for all generations. Oops. Turns out it was a healthy event. Lodgepole has to have a burn like that. In Yellowstone, the burn cycle is about every 200 years because it's high and cold. Otherwise, you don't get lodgepole. Drive through it today. A lot of you have. Pretty green. So I'm sorry, Jim. I can't jump on it, except to say that there are so many things going on that are going to change things in ways you can't figure right now. That saying anything definitive is pretty foolish.
I'd add more to that.
Do.
Most of the 20-man firefighting crews have one person that is set aside to be the what? Observer of the local environment, perhaps being in a radio contact situation, both not only with the remaining members of his own crew, but then with some other base camp where they have the latest information. Some of these fires that have killed 15 or 19 different people sometimes were almost unpredictable in terms of the weather shift it took place just in a matter of minutes. And I think the other question I'd have, it's not related to communications, is how many crews have died since the invention of the aluminum safety, whatever they call it?
Now, the whole fire shelter issue is a very interesting one. It came out of the Man Gulch fire, of course, because of Dodge's escape fire. And that idea had something to do with the development of a fire shelter. If you look at the early ones, and there's a wonderful dramatic example of it in the final episode of the television series Lassie. Anybody old enough to remember that? I got that. There, hey, Donna. I got that episode. I wrote to the people who made the film, and it's like a four-man tent. And in the final episode of Lassie, the fire's coming, and the ranger goes into this four-man tent, and end of it, and you're left to believe that he died there. There is a strenuous effort today to come up with a tent that is of a manageable weight, that would withstand heat up to 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. NASA is working on it. There's a metal bender whose son was killed on the Yarnell Hill fire who has worked on it. The Roth brother who wasn't killed on South Canyon has worked on it and come up with material that is fire resistant to a very high degree, and the Australians used it in their engines. So you pull this stuff down and you create a very warm but relatively safe zone. But they're not there yet. You can't put something that weighs 10 or 15 pounds on somebody's belt when they're carrying 40 pounds of fire gear. I mean, try it. A lot of people carry the little pack for today's fire shelter stuffed with a sweatshirt. There's a famous case of that on South Canyon, where one of the smoke jumpers who rode out the fire sitting on a log happened to be in a safe place, had an empty fire shelter container with him. And he finished, I think, something like 700 jumps. He was a real gnarly woodsman. And he just figured the fire right, and it went by him. He sat there and watched it go. So the fire shelter is seen by, well, say a parent of a child who was killed as the answer. The Australians and the Canadians don't carry them because they don't want firefighters to have a false sense of safety. So again, it's no slam dunk. But the good news is that they are coming up with a new one. A lot of people are working on it, and it promises to be a real advance on what we've had in the past. But the other thing is, if you have to take out your fire shelter, you did something wrong. Ted Putnam and I talked about that. Ted used to be at MTDC and was one of the investigators on South Canyon, and he came up with a figure based on his lengthy experience that fire shelters may have saved as many as 200 people from serious injury or death. There are a lot of times that they're used. The Dude Fire got all those people into a big safety zone, and they were in shelters, and all hell was breaking loose around them, and a lot of people died on the Dude Fire. So there are instances where they've been used and have protected people, but it's hard to prove that kind of thing. So you can use it. Please.
It's somewhat of a happy coincidence. I happen to be here at the same time as you. I'm from California, and we're retired out of Cal Fire. It seems to me our policy is to smother the fire in $100 bills before to make it go out. Do you have any thoughts on the increasing costs of wildfire, where that's going to go?
Yeah, it threatens to bankrupt PG&E, the electric utility. Well, the latest thing is that they're going to now add
Yeah, when you were talking about Yarnell, I just wondered, did you get a chance to talk to that lookout? Something I've always wondered about that was, most of the hotshot crews carry their own communication. And I've read that there was probably things going on communications-wise that nobody ever mentions. I just wondered.
Yeah, this is the silver bullet. Did Brendan McDonough hear the explanation for why they did it? And he has not been passing it on for whatever reason. I have never talked to Brendan, but Holly has, repeatedly. And Brendan has been repeatedly debriefed. His story, if you don't know it, was that he was kind of the weak sister of the Granite Mountain Hotshots. He had a criminal record, and they took him on gave him a second chance. Eric Marsh, the superintendent, made that hotshot crew a place of second chances. And it worked out. He'd been on the crew for 3 years. And he'd gone from a guy who, after the run, you'd sit there and wait for 45 minutes to an hour for Brendan to come stumbling in. And he went from that to being a full-fledged member of the crew. He'd had some kind of a day off for some reason, flu or cold or whatever. I think it's known, but I don't remember what it was. And so he was the one that was chosen about noon to be the lookout. Everybody's up on the ridge. Yarnell is down in the bottom. And when people go to get to the ridge, they come from Yarnell and get up. And the superintendent of the Blue Ridge Hotshots, Brian Frisbee, got on an ATV and made his way up to the ridge to talk to Eric. And they talked back and forth, about things, the fire, whatever. And at the end of it, Brian took a lookout down back into the valley. And that was Brendan McDonough. And he was on a track and walked about, whatever it was, 150 yards off the track to a little bump where he could see. And he had direct communication line with the people on the hill. They had trigger points set up, and if you read the frenzied accounts of the Yarnell Hill fire or watch the movie, Only the Brave, he's survived by seconds, da-da-da-da, and the fire was after him, and he got back down to the road after the trigger point, and by chance, Brian Frisbee was there with an ATV and picked him up. And in the movie, Brian Frisbee is this Neanderthal in an ATV, and he backs it into the fire in the chaparral and flames all around. Brian Frisbee is lean, trim, and smart, and he doesn't back ATVs into burning chaparral. But he picked up Brendan, took him back, and Brendan took a photograph. Click. The photograph in the bottom of it has the hood of a crew pickup truck. So we know he was back with the crew trucks. And in the distance you can see the fire, and it still hasn't reached his original lookout spot. So the notion that he was seconds away from dying is simply wrong. In that crew truck were radios that were on. And he heard some things and probably didn't hear others. He was involved in moving the trucks from an exposed position, which was later burned over, back to a rally point along the highway at the Ranch House restaurant. And for a period of time, he was able to hear and overhear communications. There are various accounts of what might have been said that weren't recorded elsewhere that are attributed to Brendan. He has played coy about this. He had a very hard time afterward, as you might imagine. I mean, he's the only survivor. He was somebody who had been taken under the wing of everybody on that crew. Had turned him from a wrong path into a right path, and he struggled. And everybody said, well, when Brendan finally tells the truth, we'll know what happened. We'll know the explanation. Don't wait for it. It's not coming. He doesn't have the key to the whole thing. And what is out there now, not particularly endorsed by Brendan, is what you're going to get. He wrote a book, well, about it. And everybody said, well, when the book comes out, he'll have that key transmission from Eric Marsh, which says we're leaving the black and we're going down to Yarnell because we want to re-engage the fire after it passes by and help save everybody the way we did on the Dosey fire. And it ain't there. It ain't there. You're going to have to look elsewhere. You're going to have to look for context to explain that move. What happened the day before? What happened an hour before? What happened during that time? Who was talking to whom? Who knew what? And that you're never going to get down to where you really know. That was one of the things that was said early about Yarnell. We will never know. Well, we know an awful lot more now than we did then. But to know in full, to know what was going on in Eric Marsh's mind, what the full communications were between him and Jesse Steed, his number two, who was no pushover. We're not going to have it. Holly and I had a talk this spring, and I said, what's left for us, Holly, that we haven't got? No, there's still stuff, we're going to keep digging and getting stuff. If we got anything big we're missing, somebody who's going to give us the silver bullet, we're there. Even she, and she is tenacious. But who knows? Maybe we'll pop something. When you get done with one of these, get a draft, and you go back and start talking to people, you'll be surprised what happens when you read them something. One of the things I do is I go back to people that I've written about, and I say, here's what's in the book from you. And sometimes they'll say something like, okay, or this is wrong, fix it. And sometimes they'll give you an additional something you didn't expect. That one extra call at the end can often come up with something big. I do not expect to have a revelation at the end of this one. I think we've got it. I think we've got to try to explain it from what we have, try to explain the context, and be frustrated but satisfied that we are never going to get that silver bullet and know exactly what was in Eric Marsh's mind and exactly what the dialogue was and exactly why 18 other people went along with that very bad decision. 20 years after the South Canyon fire, Tom Shepard, who is the superintendent of the Prineville Hotshots, who lost 9 members on that fire, finally spoke on the record publicly for a video that was put together by Eric Hipke, who was a smoke jumper who barely escaped the fire. And he put together a wonderful 2-part documentary on the 20th anniversary. And Tom talks it through. And at the end of his talk, Tom says, well, I'll tell you where I am today. So today, everybody has a voice. So you got a lot of people on the crew, and maybe the rookie there sees something that nobody else sees and speaks up. Everybody's got a voice. And when you apply that to Yarnell, you get real sad. Why? All my stories are sad. Okay, one more.
A part of my career was within the Forest Service in California on a hotshot crew, and I'll just make the comment that there is a culture within hotshot crews that's very top down, that the younger members follow the older members, follow the superintendent, almost blindly sometimes, and that sometimes has consequences.
Now, one of the things I've really enjoyed doing on this book on Yarnell is recovering the history of the hotshots, going all the way back, finding out who was the first woman hotshot, and finding out what is a hotshot. Anybody have a quick definition of what is a hotshot? Is a hotshot somebody who worked a couple of fires as a fill-in? Is it somebody who worked on a crew in the 40s or 50s that called themselves hotshots but weren't formally recognized as hotshots? And when you look for the first woman hotshot, are you talking about somebody who worked a couple of fires, half a season, or are you looking for somebody who worked a whole season, and that's who you call a hotshot? So I ask around about that. And my final definition of it is a hotshot is someone who worked on a formally designated hotshot crew for one full season minimum, fighting all the fires. So I tried that out on a guide down on the Bitterroot a couple of years ago who was a hotshot who said, oh, hell, on our crew, you got to have 2 years before we give you the belt. So it's a funny definition, but it's a wonderful history, and it's a cultural history, as you pointed out. Hotshots are very different from smoke jumpers, and that I go into in the first book, in Fire on the Mountain. I mean, when all hell breaks loose, it's every man for himself on a smoke jumper crew, and it is not like that on the hotshots. It's we're all together, always. It wasn't just Eric Marsh building a highly cohesive crew. It was the whole hotshot culture, too, that held them together. No question about that. But that was one of the fun things. Hotshots have been around now long enough that the one guy on the crew who's hanging around digs up all the old files and starts putting together the history of that hotshot crew. If you look up hotshot history on the internet, there is one that has a little history for every hotshot crew. Some of them are just kind of tossed off, and some of them are really, somebody really did something here. And people write things about what it is to be a hotshot. And I found a lot of that stuff and talked to a lot of people about it and made a big section of that in what's been written in the book so far. I spent a couple of months last year working on who is the first woman hotshot, talking to the woman who had a right to claim that and didn't because she thought there might have been somebody before her. And there were people before her, but they were just a couple of fire people. Yeah, absolutely. It's a real culture. Okay, I think we're done here. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Guys, before I let you go, I want to acknowledge that Missoula Community Access Theater's been here today filming, and they will make videos available to us at a nominal cost. So if any of you are interested in that, please contact me or Lisa at the museum. It'll be a few weeks, but I want to thank Missoula Community Access Theater because they made it possible to share this show with some people who couldn't be here today. Thank you.
And thank you all for coming today. John's going to be in the cabin signing books if you've got some of his books, or if you'd like to get some, we have some for sale in the gift shop. But again, thank you for coming. We really appreciate it.